Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presence. For me, it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Maynard, not just because she's one of the most important references in applying this approach to obtain new approaches, and because she's made one of the longest trips you can imagine throughout the whole Earth planet to come to our conference. Simone has a title in environmental science, in ecology and biology of conservation, a diploma in the management of natural resources, and a PhD focused on methodologies for assessment of ecosystem services at different scales. She has two hats. She's the manager, director, CEO of her own consultancy, and also she's a teacher at the National Australian University, and she's had a very predominant role in facilitating a social consensus for the internalization of ecosystem service approach in implementing these frameworks within public policies. In 2011 was invited for a talk with the First Minister in Australia about the approach of ecosystem services for a sustainable Australia. She's the main author of the regional assessment of the Asia Pacific for IPBES, and she's an expert liaison for theme evaluation of sustainable use of biodiversity. She's also the COP moderator of the Global Environmental Outlook of UNEP. She's taught ecosystem services in several universities. She's worked as a consultant in many projects, and we all know about the important contributions of Simone to the specialized literature on this subject. In High Impact magazine, she's a member of the executive committee of the Executive Service Partnership as the editorial committee of ecosystem services, and she's contributed to the TEEB, among other important international organisms. So, considering even beyond the importance of ecosystems attached by Simone, she's also a beneficiary of one of them, in particular the marine ecosystems, coastal ecosystem, where she spends most of her days fishing and diving as a professional diver. That she's, at least that's what she's telling us. Maybe we should request some photo evidence. So her passion for fishing and the marine world has taken her to the Galapagos, to the Blue Hole in Belize. She's fed sharks at the Bahamas. But she also declares a little bit ashamed that she has never been in the big reef barrier. Hope she will have an opportunity soon. Simone, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I would like to thank all the wonderful people that have been organising this conference and provided me the invitation, and Lucia and Pedro and Mateus, and also the foresight that all the organisations that have sponsored this event for recognising the importance of it and getting behind it and supporting it. So congratulations to you for that. I'm going to use all the people in the first few rows here as my indicator today. So I'm not generally the funniest of people, but if I see you all laughing, I'm going to assume one of two things. Either one, my skirt is tucked in my underwear and I'm unfortunately showing you a little bit more than what I planned to in this presentation, or two, I've slipped back into my Aussie slang. So I'm going to do my best to pronounce my words clearly and slowly, which is not a very easy thing for me to do. I wouldn't mind that, thank you. That's a little bit better. You got that? Yep, just making sure the chair knows. So I'm going to talk to you today about frameworks for ecosystem services. And this research that I'm going to talk to you about is really about 10 years of my work and studies that I've been working on. So just before we get into this, I want to be very clear on a few terms that I'm going to be using. And the two most important terms are methodology and framework. So if you hear me say the word methodology, I'm actually referring to three different things here. I'm talking about process, information, and tools. I'm talking about the process, which is those actions or those series of actions that you actually apply to develop an ecosystem services framework. I'm talking about the information that you actually put into that framework. That's your classification systems, your definitions, a whole range of information. Where does biodiversity fit in these frameworks? And I'm also talking about the tools. And these can be decision support tools or communication tools. And when you're dealing with transdisciplinary research, there's a very fine line between those two. So I just put them together. When I talk about a framework, I'm talking about information and tools. I'm not talking about the process, I'm just talking about the information and tools. So Professor Diaz and Laura also today and yesterday talked about conceptual frameworks. So the framework that I'm talking about goes beyond the concept. And so all those boxes you saw in the conceptual framework, the information fits into those and you have tools that identify the connections across them. And the World Resource Institute describes a framework as a structure to solve or address complex issues, and it provides both guidelines and special tools to work with. So just to get some terminology out of the way before I begin. So where do I get all this information from my presentation? So Pedro touched on some of these areas that I've been working in. One of them, up until 2 years ago, I was the project manager for the South-East Queensland Ecosystem Services project, and I'll be using SEQ for short when I talk about that. And within that, my role was to bring all the stakeholders together across the region and get them to develop a framework for identifying, measuring and valuing ecosystem services across the region. The region is 22,000 square kilometres and it holds Brisbane, the capital city of Queensland. The idea was that there's so many different frameworks out there people can use, and if all the stakeholders, whether they were local government, state government, business, industry, community groups, if everybody's using a different tool, well then our information can't connect together and we can't paint a picture of the region, of the sustainability of the region, what services are being provided and whether we're managing them correctly. So the idea was to develop one tool. And for those people that have seen Lord of the Rings, and you have the one ring to rule all rings, this is the one tool to rule all tools. The second is my PhD research. So within this research, well, I developed this one for South-East Queensland, which goes from property to regional scale, and I started thinking, what would one of these look like for Australia or for a whole nation? What would a multi-scale framework look like? So I went off and started studying, and I spent a couple of months studying with the US Environmental Protection Agency and also with the UK National Ecosystem Assessment team. And I did a series of interviews across all the leads in there. There was 33 leads I interviewed. They were all interviewed twice and for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. And so I also wanted to look at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment because since 2005, that's where we had exponential growth in framework development. So I took that as sort of the benchmark, and then I wanted to see, because all these frameworks are different out there at the moment, so I wanted to see what the changes and what the differences were in these methodologies. So we have a regional scale framework in SEQ, a national scale framework with the US Environmental Protection Agency, and a multinational one for the UK, and a global one for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. I also, as Pedro mentioned, I'm on the executive committee for the Ecosystem Services Partnership, but I'm the coordinator for the regional chapters and national networks, so I see a lot of different frameworks and methodologies come across my path. I've also been involved in CICES, the Common International Classification on Ecosystem Services, TEEB, we all know TEEB, the United Nations System of Environmental Economic Accounts, and as Pedro mentioned again, I also am involved with the IPBES, and so working with their methodology as well. Even with the UNEP, Global Environmental Outlook, different methodology again. So what you're seeing here is that I've worked across a lot of different methodologies. And they're all different. They all define ecosystem services differently. They all have different classification systems. They all have different methods for valuing ecosystem services. And they're all using different maps and models to do this. They're all completely different. There's some similarities in some areas, but otherwise. So if we're not getting this right, well then how are we supposed to communicate and get our stakeholders to use these tools? And they've been developed at different scales. They've been developed by people with different disciplines, statisticians in the environmental accounts, or ecologists, or economists. They've been developed by people in different sectors, government, non-government organisations, academia, and they've all been developed in very different contexts, whether they're different countries, different states, different regions. And so I set out to answer, what is an appropriate methodology? To develop a framework that helps us identify, measure and value ecosystem services. So those three elements that I said, the process, information and tools, I ended up turning these into 3 lines of inquiry. And I did a big literature review and I couldn't analyse everything, of course, but I wanted to have a look at just a few key things that were falling out from this research, whether they were gaps, whether they were synergies, whether they were the same, different. But so I started to look at this from processes, information and tools. When I'm looking at this from processes, I'm looking at who was involved in the development of these frameworks, how much money was invested in these frameworks, because that can influence what tools you're going to develop. I wanted to look at the structure. How were the working groups set out to develop these? And what were the factors that drove these different methodologies? In the information, I looked at these components for assessment, biodiversity. What were the assessment units? Some of these methodologies use habitats, others use ecosystems, others use environmental classes. They're not all the same. And depending what you're using, you're going to get a different outcome. I wanted to look at where ecological processes fitted into these methodologies, how were they defining ecosystem services, and were they doing dollar valuations or well-being? The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment didn't do dollar valuations, but TEEB does. And same with the tools. I wanted to look at conceptual frameworks, maps and spatially dynamic models, looking at where scenarios and reports and websites. The goal to do this was not actually to determine which one of these methodologies was best. I'm not interested to say one's better than the other, and I need to apologise to the US, to the United States and the Environmental Protection Agency right now, put it on record, that I've provided 3 examples in this presentation which unfortunately paints their framework in not a favourable light compared to the other ones. But I want to say it's just the examples that I put up there, and it's certainly no way representative of their framework, because there's some absolute brilliance within it, some brilliance that is outstanding across any of the frameworks that I've seen today. But I wanted to understand the drivers of these methodological differences. I wanted to understand why are these all so different, not just what is different, but why are they all so different. And therefore, I was going to determine an appropriate methodology that we could either use, if you wanted to pick up a framework and use one, or how would you develop one. So in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on 4 main methodologies, and these are the ones from my PhD. So this one, of course, is the South-East Queensland work that I did, and this is applied research. So this is me working for 8 years with stakeholders to develop a framework. Well, it was 4 years developing the framework, and the rest was basically trying to implement it in different ways. And then I did multiple case study analysis in my interviews, as I said, and with the national scale program in the US and the multinational in the UK. And I used the literature, of course, to underpin this with a finer focus on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as my benchmark. And these are my 3 elements, or my 3 lines of inquiry into my investigation. And recognising that obviously there's interconnections across all of these. So line of inquiry 1, process. This is just some of the bare facts about the frameworks and the programs that I'm going to speak to you about. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, South-East Queensland, the US Ecosystem Services Research Program, and the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. So there's a lot of information there. I'm not going to go into all of that, but if you look at the things that are highlighted in brown, I will call that, and they're the things that I just want you to pick out. So you can see that the SEQ, US and UK, they were all influenced by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. straight up. That was influential. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, I say it was coordinated by an NGO unit, not really an NGO, but they're not government either, so I didn't really know what else they fit more on the NGO than in the government side of things. And South-East Queensland was a non-government organisation, US was by federal government, and the UK NEA was coordinated by the UNET World Conservation Monitoring Centre. So, once again, non-government organisation. When I'm looking at funds here, the Millennium Assessment in US dollars had $24 million over 4 years to develop their framework and conduct assessment. And they record that they had at least another $7 million in pro bono input into that. In SEQ, we had $360,000. Sorry, I didn't translate it all into the same currency, but I'm sure most of you will understand anyway. Over the 4-year period, so also looking at how many years it took to develop these frameworks. So 4 years, the US had $350 million, over $70 million per year to develop their framework, and the UK had about £2 million over the 2-year period. When I look at who was involved, the Millennium Assessment records over 1,300 people were involved in it. When I say assigned, I mean employed or staffed under that budget, and I was the only person working on the SEQ program, but we had over 190 people involved in developing that framework from the different sectors. And we had 272 people assigned, so employed, by the US EPA to develop their framework. They don't know how many involved, but there wasn't much pro bono input that went into that. And the UK, they don't know how many people were actually assigned or paid to do it because the money was distributed to different stakeholders or sectors to do the work. But they do say that over 500 people were involved in its development. So what you can see from all that is a lot of people have been involved in each one of these frameworks, no matter what the scale that the framework was developed at. And then we had 2 co-chairs here running it, one project manager, and 2 co-chairs. Just to show you a bit about the structure of these programs. As I say, SEQ, US, UK, MA. People, the organisations who coordinated it, and then the number of people that were involved. You can see that these are very well structured programs. They had put people into groups, whether they were experts, whether they were the funders of the program. It was very well structured, but the US Environmental Protection Agency conducted and developed their framework in-house. The only thing that went outside of anyone that was paid was the peer review process. So based on all that, looking at that research, I came up with 68 recommendations or guiding principles. I haven't quite worked out what I should call them yet. I'm open to advice. I think they're more recommendations than guiding principles. It sounds a bit more set or defined, where some of these might require a bit of flexibility or might not be relevant to stakeholders. But 68 recommendations that you should think about if you're going to develop an ecosystem services framework, or if you're going to choose one off the shelf like the UK or the US or SEQ and try and apply it, see whether it has relevance to you or items you should consider. And they range from a whole lot of different things from, let me just have a look, keeping things at arm's length for politicians, about the role of government. There was a lot of discussion in my interviews about the role of government in developing frameworks and developing frameworks at different scales, whether they were national frameworks or whether they were place-based or regional scale frameworks like in SEQ. The time frames, the kind of expertise that's required to develop these frameworks, the collaboration approach, structures, place-based studies, and also going into the role of biodiversity, about the definition of it, where it should be placed in frameworks, the assessment units, about defining unit boundaries, ecological processes, and about the capacity of stakeholders. I'm just reading a couple out, so I'm not sure the people, you'll all be able to see them all. But there's a whole range here, down to the valuation, about developing toolkits and guidelines for valuations, also the role of conceptual frameworks, scenarios where they sit in, maps and models, websites about documenting your framework, And from all of those 68 recommendations, I had an epiphany. It came down to this one thing out of 68, is that the process that you are going to apply to develop your framework is just as important, if not more important, than the actual product, that information and tools, that framework that you're going to develop. And so, I'm going to give you 3 examples, and as you can see, the 68 recommendations, I could have given you hundreds of examples of why this is, but I'm going to give you 3 to try and show you my point. And so I'm going to tell you about how the process applied influences the type of information that you will incorporate to assess ecosystem services. It's going to influence how complex the information and tools are that you develop. And it's also going to influence stakeholder uptake and the mainstreaming of ecosystem services. So the first example, the process influencing the information. I'm going to use all 4 case studies, SEQ, US, UK, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, to show you this example. And just to let you know that all those 4 programs use the same definition of biodiversity, and that's the one from the Convention on Biological Diversity. So you'll all be very familiar with that. So when I was in the US and the UK, I asked leads. I asked 10 leads in the US and I asked 17 leads in the UK. The number was kind of irrelevant. It was the people in the right place. I didn't ask the modelling people, for example, where biodiversity should sit. I asked people who did valuations, and I asked people that ran the programs, the directors, and also the people who were developing the other information on ecosystem services and things like that. And so just to show you, in South-East Queensland, where did we put biodiversity? Is biodiversity an ecosystem service in the SEQ program? No. And so in SEQ, the stakeholders said that biodiversity is vital to functioning ecosystems and it increases flexibility and resilience. It plays an insurance role. And they weren't 100% sure, it's one of those things, where do I put it? But what they did know was that they did not want it in the list of ecosystem services. We assessed 28 different services in that framework. And the stakeholders said, if you put biodiversity in that list, it will look like it's trade-offable, for want of a better word, but trade-offable, that it'll be the 29th ecosystem service, and therefore, well, you might trade that off against recreation or something else that's on our list, climate regulation. So they said no. When I asked people in the US, 8 people said no, it's not an ecosystem service. They said that habitat is an ecosystem service. They said people care about biodiversity, but that doesn't make it an ecosystem service. They use the final ecosystem goods and services approach. So some people use the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment definition, saying that they're benefits, and some people use Boyd and Bansoff or Fisher and Turner's approach of the final ecosystem services. So the US uses the FEGS, as they call it, and they say FEGS are dependent on biodiversity. They say the subjective nature of biodiversity and our inability to actually measure and value it means it's not going in their list of ecosystem services. 2 people said yes, and they said because of its extrinsic values. And then I went to the UK, only 1 person said no, but they agreed that habitat is an ecosystem service, and 16 people said yes, it is an ecosystem service. And, sorry, I'm standing in your way. They say that the linkage, that it is an ecosystem service because of the linkage between people and other species. They said it is an ecosystem service when it's appreciated as biodiversity because some people just appreciate diversity. And they said charismatic species are ecosystem services, and they said that it can be an intermediate ecosystem service or a final ecosystem service. And then we get to Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and they don't put it in their list of ecosystems, they say it underpins, and you've all seen their conceptual diagram of where that fits. The interesting thing is that in all 4 of these programs, according to the leads, so I even spoke to one of the chairs for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, who told me that in the beginning, these programs got halted because it was such a big issue, biodiversity. And they said they couldn't go any further until this was addressed with stakeholders, with the people that were involved in the development of the framework.
But in the US, the same issue came up, but it wasn't addressed. They didn't follow it up any further. So I asked them why. So I also asked the UK, of course, and one of the UK leads said that this issue of biodiversity, when it fits in a framework, is a very important question to solve at the very beginning. They said a lot of people have been working in this paradigm of thought, this biodiversity, for a very long time now. They spent a lot of time convincing governments this is what you should care about. And they said to suddenly turn around and go, oh, ecosystem services, they thought was, without making the link between ecosystem services and biodiversity, was actually quite problematic, quite dangerous, and it also has the potential to alienate a lot of stakeholders. When I asked the US why they put it where they did, and why their program didn't get halted like all these other ones did, they said the US is quite orientated towards biodiversity. And they're not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity or for migratory species. They also said that biodiversity is not an EPA mandate, and of course it was coordinated by the EPA, the development of the framework. And they said that EPA does not have the authority to legislate land use, which is key to maintaining biodiversity. So what drove these differences? The cultures of the countries and the missions and the mandates behind the organisations that were coordinating these. So my example 2. This one is how the process influences how complex your information and tools are going to be. This time I'm just going to use South-East Queensland and the US program to show you this example. I'm going to talk about ecological processes as one of the parts of information and the role of maps and models. South-East Queensland. So, silly me. Started the project thinking, yes, all excited, we're going to go in there, we're going to map ecosystem services, stakeholders are going to use this, they're going to have, be able to identify, measure and value these. This is fantastic. Took them out to a workshop, had these fabulous maps developed, got the mapping people in my organisation to do these up for me, took them out to the stakeholders and didn't want them. They turned around and said there was too much information on them. And the valuing ecosystem services is context dependent. So those maps of ecosystem services weren't relevant to all their decision-making context. There would be different indicators, different layers, depending on what they were trying to actually do with the framework. They said they wanted to know about the potential to provide ecosystem services rather than actual. They said they wanted to understand the capacity of the region to provide ecosystem services. So that went back to ecosystem functions or ecological processes, using those terms interchangeably. So we developed these maps, went back to the drawing board, tail between our legs, and we developed ecosystem function maps. So these function maps, each of the data sets within the function map, so this is a single one that we have here, is a pathway to how that function can be performed. So let's take soil retention, for example. We know vegetation on slopes retains soil, so that is one of our data layers. And so we end up developing these maps. We have 19 functions that we assess in the SEQ framework, and this map here in pink and green is the 20th map, and that's all the 19 function maps overlaid to show areas in the region that have high potential to provide ecosystem services due to the processes that are going on in those areas. Stakeholders like them. They said that's what we need. We need to know the basic foundations of what's going on in our region, and from there, when we're making a decision, we can overlay the layers that we need for our decision and to determine the ecosystem services that can come from those. They also, when we talked about models, well, we didn't have much money in our program. Those figures that I put up there were also to pay for the people that were involved. So that figure I put up there for SEQ was also my wage. And to be honest, my program ran off a $10,000 budget per year. I was given $10,000 and told to develop a framework for the region with all the stakeholders. So thanks for that. And there wasn't a lot of money to do these spatially dynamic models that are brilliant. I can't get my head around most of them that are out there, but the stakeholders turned around and said that we don't have any capacity to use those anyway. So they said they didn't want spatially dynamic models. They said they don't have the capacity to understand them and they don't have the capacity to be able to apply them. And now here's an example. My region has 11 local governments in it. So I have the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast, high population, a high amount of rates. They had $230,000 to do 3 case studies on ecosystem services. How jealous was I with my $10,000 budget to develop the whole thing? And so they had high capacity. They could do these models, no problems. But then I go out into my rural areas, out in the Somerset local government, and now they don't have a lot of money coming in because they don't have the rates, there's not a lot of people living out there in bigger properties, all the rest. And so if I wanted to develop that tool, that one tool to rule all tools, have to develop a framework that has the ability for the people with the lowest capacity, the stakeholders, the sectors with the lowest capacity, to be able to use it, as well as those people with the high capacity. So they ended up saying we want some simple scoring tools, so we developed these methods, ran a series of expert panels, filled these in with scores, and then we had this opportunity to look at these interconnections. We ran community workshops that helped us fill in these constituents or wellbeing elements, and the stakeholders were satisfied. Now in the US, so I asked the US, because in their framework they don't even talk about ecological processes. It doesn't exist in their framework. So I asked them, why don't you have a focus? Why do we have such a focus in SEQ on processes, but you don't have the focus what's going on here? And this is what I was told. The focus is on the FEEBs, and the specific ecological processes and intermediate services may be unknown or poorly known. The intermediate services reside, therefore, in the domain of the ecological process modelers who have the task of understanding the workings of the ecosystems and produce the effects through the complex interactions of the intermediate services. By focusing on the FEEBs, we can then efficiently identify and understand those intermediate services that are essential to FEEBs production. I barely understand what that means. So I could imagine walking into my local government in Somerset and saying, hey, you need some ecological process modelers to be able to apply this framework. It's not happening for me. But remembering at the national scale, the US program was developed in-house. There was a big difference, however, in the US program. They have 5 place-based studies within this. And these 5 studies are similar to the SEQ scale. They're like regional scale frameworks in there. So they use this national framework and the information that comes out of that, but then they're taking it out to stakeholders and making it more context dependent. So these were highly collaborative, these place-based studies. And so one of the leads from one of the place-based studies said there's 3 groups of people that we want to engage with. We want to engage with the public, we want to engage with their representatives, managers, neighbourhood associations, city mayors, natural resource managers, and we also want to engage with the science and the technical people so they could have that local knowledge input. They said the tools that we developed to support ecosystem service assessments would look a lot different, that they would be much more complex if they hadn't gone and worked collaboratively and received stakeholder feedback. And the lead who actually said that made the same mistake as me with the service maps, thought they knew what their stakeholders wanted, went and did it, and then found out the hard way. So participation and collaboration was really key to what was driving those information and tools at that place-based scale, but the lack of it was actually driving the information and tools that were happening at the national scale. The third example is about the processes influencing the uptake and mainstreaming of ecosystem services. So these frameworks were basically finished about 5 years ago. And so now with the Millennium Assessment, the SEQ, US and UK, looking at all 4 methodologies and just looking at the uptake by stakeholders of these frameworks and looking at where they might have had some policy traction. So in South-East Queensland, since developing the framework, we've managed to get ecosystem services into local government nature conservation strategies, local government water resource strategies, local government community plans, It's become a guiding principle which underpins the natural resource management plan for the region, in which all stakeholders have agreed to meet a series of targets within that plan. It's also became policy. Policy 4.3, the statutory regional planning document, now says that you have to use the SEQ framework to identify, measure and value ecosystem services. And also, the framework that was developed is the program to meet 3 other policies in that statutory plan. Energy companies, utility companies are starting to use this in their property management planning processes, and that's just some of the examples. In the UK, a couple of months after their framework and their assessment was released, a white paper was developed by their national governments. There's also been numerous other programs that have been picking up that framework, including the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in Australia has been using the UK for a lot of their work. Israel's National Ecosystem Assessment is based on the UK approach, and there's others. Well, we all know the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's used in most international conventions now. But when I look at the US, it's now slowly being used or trialled in external programs to the Environmental Protection Agency. And I thought this was really exciting, going really well, but I was in Washington DC last year and attended a workshop that is part of the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, it's a collaboration of all the federal agencies in the US, so USGS and Wildlife Services and all the rest. And they've developed a Federal Resource Management and Ecosystem Services Guidebook. And I was going through the methodology in there, and it looks nothing like what the EPA has developed. So, collaborative development made a very significant difference to it being taken up, basically. So my point here is that focusing on the process to develop a framework is going to lead to a more salient, legitimate and credible products than focusing your attention just on developing the product or conducting the assessment. And so I recognise this comes with huge challenges, because a lot of people are actually afraid of the whole collaboration, working with people, and people say, oh, you know, it's hard, it takes a long time, all these things, and it does. It does. And so I thought I'd be very honest about some of the challenges here, and one of them is not just identifying the right organisations to be involved, but the right people within the organisations. Engaging those people who are unengaged, like the health sector and the business, we all know that that's challenging. Bringing practitioners and policymakers together is actually really challenging as well. They tend to have their own meetings and workshops, and bringing them together is quite hard. It requires a lot of personal energy, I won't deny that. And it comes to, I don't know if you know the word, but depersonalising the problems and the issues that you're going to find. So when people are critical of what you put together, like my ecosystem service maps, you know, you need to dust yourself off and go, oh well, you know, issue, it's not about me personally, you know, so not to take it personal. The time and the resources that involved, these things are highly dynamic working with stakeholders. They can change, you know, the direction at any point within there, so you need to be prepared to adaptively manage your program. You need to understand, more importantly, that you are going to take 2 steps forward and then 1 back. And it will happen the whole way through your program. But the benefits of it. Now, the benefits of it, as you can see, will just incredibly different. So you can share resources. You can share your skills with other people, with other organisations, other sectors. You can share budgets. You can share time. Less complex information tools. That's always good to have. And you'll have more user-useful tools, of course. Building solid networks and partnerships across your stakeholders. There's that social learning and the learning while doing. Our stakeholders in South-East Queensland didn't know ecosystem services, and so we started, you know, bringing them to meetings, and then they all learnt together, and they all taught each other and taught me, and together you just developed a shared understanding of what this was, and everyone came together for the same goal. A greater understanding of people's values. Now, that's significantly important. Someone mentioned in yesterday's program about whether ecosystem services can be used the conflict or help in terms of resolving conflicts. From my experience working with communities, absolutely. Working with some of my workshops, one of the ones that I had in particular, I had over a dozen people come up and go, wow, I didn't know all of that had to go into a decision-making process, you know, if a local government wanted to develop a plan, or if a development was going to go in this area. So there was an understanding that people had different values to them, and somehow, you know, the people that are managing these have to find that compromise to make people happy. It's stakeholder empowerment. You're putting the power back into their hands. You're letting them, you know, because they understand ecosystem services, they know how, have a better idea of how to use it, rather than developing a tool and then going out and saying to them, oh look, I've got a great tool, don't you want to use it? You know, these people have developed their own tools here for use. That stakeholder ownership, as I say, is not just the empowerment, but it wasn't a Simone Maynard Ecosystem Services framework, or the SEQ Catchments, the company that I worked for, Ecosystem Services framework. It was the SEQ framework. I was just the lucky person that was privileged enough to coordinate it for the stakeholders. And that feeling that they can contribute to their own development. They've developed this framework now. They feel like they can do it. They feel like they can, you know, move forward with this and use it. But some of the lessons I learned personally, because there was a lot of personal learning curves, as I said, highly dynamic, be prepared to change the way you think, because you're going to get proven wrong in the process. You get to know your stakeholders, which is great. I don't work for that company anymore. I've been 2 years out of the program. I still get phone calls all the time from utility agencies. Oh, Simone, you know. So you need to engage the stakeholders as early and often as possible. Question them and listen to them, not just, you know, do the talking, but really listen and question and dive into it and respond and communicate with them. Create communities and champions within your sectors. So I actually had 28 ecosystem services and I had a champion for each one of them. We started developing a website. I had 64 people that are writing me narratives for free. You know, that's pretty cool. But the skills that you need to have a good conflict resolution and negotiating skills, definitely a sense of humour, have empathy for your stakeholders. They're very frustrated. You know, this isn't their area, so have empathy for them, and empathy in terms of what they actually have to go to make a decision and to actually use and develop these. Coordinator needs to have multidisciplinary knowledge and ability to simplify complex information, because I'm getting Indigenous knowledge coming in 1 year, local experts are telling me one form of information, I've got other coming in from literature, I'm reading maps, I'm dealing with other models and outputs of these. You need to be able to create the political space to make this happen. So someone's going to provide that opportunity and create that political space so that you can cross knowledge systems, which is absolutely a necessity. Set up a well-coordinated facilitated program with strong leadership. Traditional paradigms of thought. Very hard in Australia, many people are still very focused on biodiversity paradigm, and they don't like the idea of putting values on nature. So dealing with these different paradigms of thought, and recognising the way that we're currently thinking might not necessarily be what we need to move forward. And of course needing a central platform where we can house all this information. And it needs to be free and it needs to be easily accessible, so those people with the lowest capacity can be able to use these. And most importantly, never assume, because there's an old saying, to assume makes an arse out of you and me. So my example of ecosystem service maps is a really good one there. But most importantly, have fun with your stakeholders, make it fun, you know, have a good time with them. So once again, my recommendations here, 68 of them from all of that work over the years. I basically want to pose to you the questions: what are your drivers behind your methodology, and how appropriate is your methodology for assessing ecosystem services? Thank you.
minutos para hacerle preguntas y 2 recomendaciones. Una es que a Simone le van a estar traduciendo simultáneamente las preguntas y por eso es importante que hagamos preguntas concisas y breves, y eso va a tener como beneficio adicional la posibilidad de hacer más preguntas. O sea, por favor,